Hello and welcome to Story Bearers and Peacemakers. My name is Dan Morrice. I'm author of Finding the Peacemakers here in Bristol, and my good friend Phil Knox, author of Story Bearer, is joining us from the wonderful Birmingham, the Venice of the North, and we're going to be interviewing each other actually to talk about our own books and our stories, but also exploring how we can all become peacemakers and story bearers in the communities where we all live. Phil, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Dan. Brilliant to be with you, and hi everybody out there. Yeah, I'm a husband, I'm a dad, I'm a resident of the Venice of the North. Thanks for that introduction, Dan. Also part of the team at the Evangelical Alliance. I'm a church leader, and as Dan said, I'm the author of Story Bearer. It's just so brilliant to be with you, Dan, talking about your book, and maybe that's just a great place to start, really. Wondered if I could just ask you a few questions about that. And if anyone has not seen it, this is the book, Finding the Peacemakers. It's just absolutely wonderful. I got this book a few weeks ago, really enjoyed it. Kind of felt I went along the adventure with Dan, which we're going to kind of unpack over the next few minutes. But Dan, there's loads of stories in here about you as an adventurer. One of the first stories, for those who haven't read this yet, is that Dan's fascinated by the story of the Copiapo mine disaster that happened 2010. Is that right, Dan?
It is, yeah.
And he was really fascinated by this story. So he was like, I really want to find out more. So most of us at that point would whack it into Google. Dan, you called up the miners and said, I want the inside track. And so I love the bit where you call up the guy, and then you're like, and he basically says to you, call me when you land, which I just thought was absolutely wonderful. And again, most people at that point would kind of give up and go, I'm not going to Chile. But you get on a plane, get out there, and there's a real, throughout the book, throughout your various adventures, this real kind of can-do spirit that comes across. And I'd love to start, Dan, by just asking you kind of where that came from. What were the kind of influences in your life that grew that curiosity and adventurous spirit in you that makes you say, do you know what, if someone says, call me when you land in Chile, I'm actually going to do it?
Yeah, for sure. Well, to be honest, I love biography as a young man. I think growing up, I come from quite a secular sort of environment. I just went to a regular comprehensive school. My mates were mostly atheists. And I had this sort of part of my life where someone had told me the gospel, and I'd thought the life and the teaching of Jesus was amazing. But I didn't quite know how to translate that into my normal world. It's quite odd to be a Christian in the 90s in a regular school. And I was always kind of wondering, what does it look like? And I'd read these biographies of the great heroes of faith, like Amy Carmichael, who outlawed child slavery in India and in Tamil Nadu state particularly. And then like Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, there were this amazing story. Some people know that story, but for those who don't, this was one of the ones that captured me. Yeah. Jim Elliot went out to the Ecuadorian jungle to kind of just reach out to what was rumored to be one of the most savage tribes in the world. And he was killed. They speared him to death, and several friends, and everyone said, what a waste of time. And then his wife, Elizabeth Elliot, said, well, if we want to tell them about the love and the forgiveness of Jesus, then I need to go and say, I forgive you. So she did. And these people who had only ever known revenge their whole life, they experienced this real forgiveness from her for the death of their husband. She met his killers, and it transformed that community just in real love. And I read those stories and I thought, wow, what's happening? Where are those happening today? And I really think those stories are happening today all over the world. But for me, the conviction was, I feel like they've been, some of those, particularly more spiritual ones, have been slightly airbrushed out of the media, and we're quite a politically correct society, and people don't know what to talk about faith, and so I was just hungry to know where those stories are happening. The sort of can-do spirit, I was happy to take risks, but I also need to point out I'm not a great adventurer. I always say there's two sorts of adventurers. There's the Bear Grylls types who know what they're doing, they've got some experience. And then there's the Bilbo Baggins types. I'm on an adventure, I'm totally out of my depth. Are these other guys going to realise I don't know what I'm doing? Yeah. And so, all the way through the book, I wanted to be honest about the fact that I was in a pickle most of the time. And I depended on the grace of God, not as like a nice spiritual thing to say, but as a sort of, I've got no backup plan, help God. Help God was probably my most frequent prayer.
Yeah, that comes across quite strongly, Dan, Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Matt. That's really good. And I think there's, I don't know about you, and you wrote it, but I think when people read this, I imagine some people will go, do you know what? I want to be a bit more like Dan. I'm going to go and, take that step to be more adventurous. And so I think, that's the first real thing to say. If you're someone who wants to be a bit more adventurous, and maybe you feel a bit more like Bilbo Baggins than Bear Grylls, it's a great reason to get the book. Really, really cool. But that's not the major theme of the book. The major theme is what it says on the tin, which is finding the peacemakers. And I just love that. It's a really heartwarming read, Dan, because there's so much stuff in there where you're like, again, there's so much bad news in the news, isn't there? And I think so often I talk about being good news people in a bad news world. What you do is tell the good news of what's going on in terms of the hearts of people. And again, when you get hold of the book, you read about the stories of Jose Enriquez, who was the pastor in the mine, who basically kept peace amongst all the miners down there. And I love the story about how they had a daily act of forgiveness that he kind of curated. We meet Reza, who's in a refugee camp, and he gets placed in Finland. Is it right? He gets he gets the opportunity to have asylum in Finland, and he turns it down because he feels God's called him to play a role as a peacemaker in this camp. And there's this wonderful, I think it's a wonderful line is that says that no one turns down Scandinavian countries. That's exactly. And then we meet Kareem, who has his face scarred by fire as a young man, and then forgives those who did that to him. I was really moved. I'm not a massive crier, Dan, but I've got to say that when you tell the story of Dave the football hooligan, reuniting with Divi, and I guess I just wanted to give people an idea of the breadth of the peacemakers we meet in this book. But you've met them all. Can you tell me what are the things that you see in them that kind of unites them about as peacemakers and people to aspire to be like?
Yeah, good question. Well, to be honest, I'd say I didn't actually see this theme to begin with. So the book really was a journey of faith. I didn't quite know how it would come together. I followed the stories I felt like God was leading me to and the doors that opened. And there was actually when I completed the whole book, and I didn't see it, was actually my editor, Jess, so huge kudos. That was her idea, the Peacemakers. And it suddenly kind of, it came into view, and I thought, how did I miss this? They're exactly as you say, all these different people who had just had that same sort of faith, that same desire for peace. And I kind of put them together. And as you say, it's like, what are the common themes? I was kind of interested. And for me, I think probably the main one was just, I'll mention a few, but the main one was just real surrender and real sacrifice. And I think there was one particular guy, Sami Awad, who I met in Bethlehem, and he really kind of summarized all the stuff that I'd learned from other people along the way. And he talked about peacemaking being a sacrifice and a real surrender, and it's servant-hearted. And I think a lot of people have the idea that you can just kind of go to two warring tribes and help them to, love each other. But actually, the real calling of a peacemaker involves you laying down your own agenda. Right, remember Sami saying that line in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the peacemakers," is followed by "Blessed are the persecuted." And he said, you don't know who's going to persecute you. So if you're reaching out to your enemy in real love and real reconciliation, sometimes your enemy doesn't want that. They're like, actually, no, I don't want peace. And then sometimes the people on your side also don't want peace with the enemy. They want revenge. And so if you really want to be forgiving, then some people don't want that. And actually, partly it's laying down your own agenda. Often when you get hurt or when someone's upset you, if you really want to make peace with that person, you just have to let go of some stuff. You have to be like, you know what, I forgive you. And that's hard. So I'd say the first one is real humility. And I saw actually a Jose at the beginning in the mine. He wasn't so much negotiating a stalemate sort of peacemaking. He just brought a real presence, a real sort of shalom. And the other miners noticed it. They're like, look, this is a very stressful situation. How come you're so chilled? And he just had this real faith that God was with them. And I think the others just saw something in him. And they're like, look, help us find what you've got. Yeah. And that's when he started, some guys had stolen emergency rations on day one. And he's like, look, we've got to, as you say, we've got to forgive them. And there was just that real desire to lay down your agenda, what you want to do, your rights, just all of that has to go. And to be a peacemaker involves preferring the other. And the other thing I'd say is that you have to be brave. So partly it's surrendering your own agenda, but also it takes courage to do that and to really love the other. I think one of the things I found most helpful is when, particularly Israel-Palestine is, it's a famous, very globally divisive issue. And I find lots of people I met just even sadly in the West, people just seem to choose one side. And before I went, I spent a long time in the land in Israel and Palestine, in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, different cities, different communities, Arab, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, met all sorts of different people. Before I went, often people would just tell me their narrative. They're like, these are the good guys and they're the bad guys. And you go to a different pub and they'll tell you the opposite.
Yeah.
And I thought that was so sad, because actually everyone I met had the capacity for real love. And actually I met loads of people who really wanted peace. Yeah. Actually, sometimes in the international community, there's more anger. Yeah. And the people on the ground, I met so many people who had lost a loved one. Yeah. From the other. There's an interesting movement called the Parent Circle, where parents on both sides meet together and they're like, you know what, this is stupid. I could be angry with you, but you've lost someone as well. Let's just make sure that the next generation doesn't have so much hatred and death, And there was this real desire for peace. And so for Sammy, that meant trying to put himself in the shoes of the other. Yeah. And what he would do is he would go to a Jewish community, and bear in mind his grandfather had been killed in the Nakba catastrophe in 1948 by Israelis. His family had been made refugees. He was turfed out. Yeah. So he was in a community that was very angry. But he would go to the Jewish communities and say, look, I'm all ears. Yeah. You tell me your version of events. Wow. And just listen. Yeah. And then they would listen to him. And then both sides, even if they couldn't reconcile, they'd be like, okay, I hear your story now. And that's the first step, is just to listen. Actually, that's what I loved about your book. There was a couple of lines in it which I wanted to pick up on. Yeah. You talked about real listening. And I think that's a thing that we've lost a little bit in the West, in our sort of distracted culture. You know what it's like when you can tell it on the phone sometimes, even if you can't see him. You're talking to the other person's, it's just a pause. Yeah. 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 Like you're doing something else.
The problem is now, Dan, I'm acutely aware as how good am I at listening to you at this moment, but carry on.
Yeah, exactly. No pressure. You said this about friendship. You said online friendship can be almost completely cost-free. Offer and acceptance comes with a simple click. There's no obligation to give any significant amount of time, and superficial conversation can be maintained by the occasional reaction to a status via an emoji. But real friendship costs something. And I found that so important, because actually, you want those friends who, not just like your post, who you could call up at 3 a.m. and say, I'm having a hard time and I'll come round. And just imagine if you could do that with someone who's actually someone that the other people will tell you is your enemy. And Sammy has those friends. He has Israelis who've been raised to believe that he's the enemy, and he's been raised to believe that they're the enemy. And yet he has friends who have that level of friendship. Yeah. And I think that's wonderful. You can't beat that.
No. And I think what will happen as people read your book, Dan, is that people will, as well as wanting to be adventurers, people themselves will want to become peacemakers in their everyday, because you don't have to go to Israel to find conflict. It's everywhere, isn't it? Tell me a bit about kind of, you clearly have a heart and a passion to see people to bring peace into their everyday. Tell me a bit more about how you hope that will inspire people by reading the book.
Well, I think actually the thing that I'm really passionate about is people reaching out to people in their actual community. So I think one of the problems in the West that we've experienced in this cultural moment is that people are so engaged at the political level. So people are talking about the leaders and what they should be doing, one side or the other, and it gets such anger whipped up at different sides. But actually, most of it makes no difference. Whatever you think of Boris, he probably doesn't care, you know what I mean? But I feel like, the one person you can reach out to is your neighbour.
Yeah, great.
So I often say, I have the same challenge myself. I can get sucked into political debates just like anyone else. But sometimes I think, what if I just put my phone down and went and knocked my neighbour's door and said, how you doing? Because that would make genuinely, if everyone in the country did that, it would make far more difference to health and the life of a nation than everybody fighting on social media, left, right. So I think for me, I just wanted to encourage people, and Sammy said the same, is like, it's not just here, you go to the people in your community, but maybe you don't understand, or, different faith, different religion, different culture, different background, or maybe really similar to you, but just voted differently. Oh, goodness me, you're left, they're right, they're blue, you're red, whatever. And just sit down and have a chat to them. And just like you said in your book, just listen. Without advising, without jutting in. Sometimes you're talking to someone and they're doing this, Like you just want to, you're like, just hang on a second. And when you can chat to someone and you're just listening, it's liberating. So I would just say, I always encourage everybody, go and be that person. Go and sit down and just listen to someone and say, and this is what you do in your book, you say, what's your story? Yeah. Such a great open question, because people can do whatever they like with that. And often people talk for hours. So because no one's ever asked them. And I've learned so much from asking people that question, what's your story?
Yeah, cool. We're going to have a slight interlude at this point where I'm going to ask you a few quick fire ones to break the pace. You talk about a moment where you needed some stuff for your feet, some stuff for your belly, and you need something for your soul. And you talked about hip flask. I want to know what was in the hip flask on your journey.
It's actually Bushmills. So nice. real Scotch whiskey fans are horrified I had Irish whiskey.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine.
I love Bushmills.
There's also there's an amazing moment where you talk about your journey from Egypt to right up through Israel. Now I imagine that was, and you can see on the cover, that's very beautifully visually spectacular. Are there any other places where people can find photos from your journey?
Yeah, well, actually, we'll put some photos up on the screen. I took a lot of photos on the way, mainly because I just thought some of the stories I encountered were so remarkable. I thought people might not believe them. I want to show people. So where I can, I've had little video interviews, and I've got some photographs of the people I met, and where I can, I've had, where it's safe to do so, I've shared their voices and their stories. So all that, you can put the photos on the screen. All that is going to be, it was on my social medias, basically. So the project around the book is called the Lukács Project. So I was doing that with a team. There was translators and filmmakers there as well. And so just search the Lukács Project on Facebook and Instagram.
Lukács Project.
Yeah, so Luke is in the name Luke, X Project. So Lukex Project. You'll find it.
Cool. One thing I loved doing while I was reading your book, Dan, is you talk about this motivational moment where you were talking about being in the wilderness, and you talked about a song on your Spotify playlist. Now, as I was reading the book, I tried to get into my kind of, my inner Dan. So I put that song on as I was reading that little bit from the Grey Havens. I want to know what else was on your Spotify playlist as you're on your own for all this time.
It was an odd mix, to be honest. So I had a bit of Stormzy, got me going in the morning. Lauren Daigle, very different to Stormzy, but very motivational, beautiful lyrics, beautiful voice. And then Hillsong is kind of like my go-to in any situation. And then the Grey Havens I already got into as well. So I don't know if anyone's ever made a playlist of Stormzy, Lauren Daigle, Hillsong, and the Grey Havens.
What we need is, if not, we need the Peacemaker. We need the Peacemaker playlist. And,
I'll get onto it. Yeah, very good.
Great. Okay. So the next thing around I want to talk to you about is that you talk about when you do this epic. Was it 300 miles? Is that right?
500 miles.
500 miles. I'm sorry for underplaying that. 500 miles. Every single one of those. You talk about the kind of the challenge it is and the lack of comfort you felt. There's a moment where I think there's a line where you say, despite the challenges of the journey, I wouldn't trade it for all the comforts in the world. I was really fascinated by that, because I'm observing in this time, there's a lot of people really growing during this time, emotionally, spiritually. I believe the Bible verse where it says that perseverance produces character. And how have you seen that in this last season of coronavirus, that same spirit that you encapsulate in this book, that you wouldn't trade the challenges for the comforts of the world?
I would say I think it's very, you read certain verses in scripture about trusting God, and it can seem really nice, but actually, because we have quite comfortable lives in the West, we did until a year ago, until you're really tested, those things, you don't want to be masochistic, you don't want to go and make life really difficult, but there's just times when life becomes hard, and then those verses mean something, and you pray so for me, there was a lot of moments in the desert, particularly, where I prayed not as the last resort, as a first and last resort. I ran out of water and I prayed that prayer, but sustained me the whole way. Dear God, help. And in those moments, when there were some particular moments when God just showed up, and then you're never the same again. You can't unsee those moments. Yeah. And so, I think real friendship is forged in adversity. So just like the miners after 69 days underground, they have a level of friendship, they have depended on each other to survive. Yeah. You can't replicate that level of friendship just in the pub with your mates.
Brotherhood.
What's that?
It was a brotherhood.
Exactly, the brotherhood. And I think it's the same in our faith. Like Jesus says, I call you friends. Yeah. And in the same way, when you go through a battle together and you emerge out of it stronger, you have a stronger friendship. And I think God wants that. And he doesn't put us through strain deliberately. He's not like that, but I think he uses the challenges to draw alongside us and say, "I got you, mate." And those moments when you depend on him. And I always say he doesn't necessarily make things easier. And so for me, for example, there was many times when I just thought, look, give me a helicopter, get me to Nazareth, and that's not what happened. But I did have moments where I sensed his presence with me, and that made it beautiful.
Yeah. Just talking about that, the kind of last stages of your journey. Just final question for you this evening, Dan, around what I love. It's a beautifully crafted book. And the kind of narrative arc, what happens towards the end is, I'm not spoiling the ending, I don't think too much. You're still alive, so you definitely don't die in the desert. You slow us right down and kind of, it's almost like you're a kind of tour guide around the kind of various sites around Israel. And you kind of close with some of the beautiful moments of the Easter story. Now, obviously it's Easter this weekend, so that's timely to be talking about that now. As you were going around, were there any moments where you kind of, being in the Holy Land, there were some places which brought the Easter story alive in any way? Were there kind of any moments where you're like, wow, I now get fresh insight into this story as a result of being here?
Oh, absolutely. So I'd say the desert and Galilee were two of the main regions. There's a lot of sort of shrines and churches and building around some stuff, but I quite like the areas where it's like it was 2,000 years ago. Like the desert hasn't changed much. And I think for me, that one of the things I found really powerful about it, particularly seeing some places, was the realization that this happened. And so whilst I was physically in the desert, I was also doing a lot of homework in terms of the sort of latest archaeological discoveries and doing I was doing my academic homework, and then I was physically in the desert trying to piece it together. And I was really surprised by, just really convicted by the fact that whatever people think about Jesus, he was real and he was there and he did this stuff, and the evidence is overwhelming. So I kind of wanted to invite people just to consider his life, and the things he said and the things that he did. And often I ask people who have a different sort of faith to me, I often say, look, if Jesus wasn't divine, if there was nothing special about him, then how did a sort of refugee turned carpenter become the most influential person in human history? That for me feels like a leap of faith. So I just wanted to kind of open up his journey, invite people into often the very humble and human parts of his life. Didn't want to be too preachy, just wanted to kind of get into his story.
Yeah.
And then just kind of leave it with people, really, just so everyone has the opportunity to consider it. But just to consider it in the actual places and tell the stories and look at the details and the evidence and that kind of stuff. And I kind of think that's what I'd love to ask anyone, Christians, non-Christians, different faiths. Jesus is central to almost every faith. And even, to humanists would often say, who don't believe in God, well, Jesus was an inspiring figure. So I just think, is there something in his life that we could capture in this moment?
Yeah.
And I really believe that God, I believe, I'm more honest in the book. I don't want to be preachy, but also really dishonest. I'm like, I believe. So, and I think there's a story of God is pursuing different people. And I think for a lot of people, Christians like me, who have always thought, how do I share my faith? For me, I thought I'd go on a journey and kind of encapsulate the life of Jesus and the places he was. But also for me, my testimony isn't that exciting. I looked into the claims of Jesus, I did my homework, and I was convinced. Yeah. And yet some of the people I've met on my journey have such amazing testimony, like Dave Gill, the football hooligan you mentioned. He left a life of violence. I mean, years and years of anger and hatred and all sorts of trouble. Yeah. In a moment of God, in sort of Damascus road experience, that all turned around, and he became a football chaplain and a prison chaplain and a Navy chaplain, and just as great a force for love as he previously was for anger. And I found that inspiring. But I thought, I don't have that sort of story. Yeah. And that's what I loved about Story Bearers I felt like you tried to help people capture their own story, and kind of work out how they can share this with their friends in a way which isn't weird, it's not religious. I feel like you have a passion to say, look, everyone's got a story.
Yeah.
How can you share it? So maybe I want to turn around a little bit now and ask you some questions. And so maybe just to begin with, could you just tell us the sort of vision and the heart? Why did you want to write this book that helps people capture their story?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think it begins with a similar passion, really. I think I've seen the difference, just as you've seen the difference that Jesus made in the people you met lives. I've seen the difference this refugee carpenter has made in people's lives. And I think we write about what really moves us. you know, what really moves me on the deepest possible level is knowing that I'm loved by the King of the world, you know, and that, you know, that really moves me. And, you know, Easter reminds us of that. You know, this morning I was on my morning walk and I walked past the church where I live, and my best mate, who's a kind of builder, incredibly gifted, has kind of made this beautiful cross that goes on the front of our church, which is lit up. And as I walked past it, even though I've followed Jesus for over 30 years, I was really moved to the core, because I remembered that just reminded me that Jesus died for me. And I guess this is to a great extent, I've always wanted other people to know that. And so, you know, someone who really not only loves Jesus themselves, but also wants other people to know that they're loved. Both research and experience tells me that the way people encounter this love for themselves is through friendship, you know. And so, you know, the guy I've just talked about, Adam, my best mate, he was my best mate at school. We met, you know, on probably the first day of secondary school. And I tell a story in the book about his journey to faith through over 10 years of praying for him, trying to do my best, messing up, trying to tell my story, inviting him to stuff and him not come in. But, you know, when he was 21, he became a Christian, and his life now is so unbelievably different. You know, he's making crosses and putting on the front of churches, you know. And I was not an expert evangelist as a teenager. I was just a friend who tried to do my best. And I think, you know, your story about Peacemakers is the same, you know, friends trying to do their best. And I think that the way the world is changed is not through preachers on platforms, it's through everyday Christians living an authentic life and sharing their story with people who don't know Jesus yet.
Oh, amazing. So what would you say to someone who feels like, I don't really have a story? Like, what would be your encouragement? How would you tell them, yes, you do?
Yeah, and I guess the really simple message of the book is that if you are a Christian, you have a story to tell. Jesus has changed your life. You've encountered the creator of the universe, and that story, no matter how boring you think it is, it has the power to change someone else's life. You know, I think there's a line in the book that my teenage years were less sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and more projects, hugs, and sausage rolls. Because I used to go to kind of, you know, these Christian events, and there'd be this person on stage who had a story like your hooligan mate who, you know, beat people up and kicked puppies and pushed old ladies into the road and took drugs and, you know, drank alcohol through their eyes, and then they met Jesus and everything was okay. My story wasn't like that. So what the book kind of unpacks is how to talk about why you're a Christian. And my best piece of advice really is when someone asks you why you're a Christian is to tell your story and think about the words you'd use, and also not think about just the moment you became a Christian. So often what happens when people tell their story is they talk about the moment they became a Christian, but then nothing else. You know, if you asked me about my relationship with my wife, my family, I wouldn't tell you just about the moment I met Danny. I'd talk about what life is like now and the journey of friendship and faith. And so that's, my hope is that people read Storybear and go, I've got a story, it's worth telling, it can change someone's life. Yeah,
definitely. Oh, that's so helpful. And just there's one like side tangent in the book which I really liked. You got into the moment where you talked a bit about the sort of science of storytelling, and I found that so cool. Like I quite like my sort of evidence behind stuff. As soon as someone airy fairy, I'm a bit like, yeah, but is it, you know, give me some facts. And you sort of just zoomed in and sort of unpacked why, you know, in terms of how our brains are wired, why we are narrative creatures. Could you share some of the sort of biology of storytelling? That'd be great.
Yeah, the inner teacher's coming out, Dan. That's beautiful.
Exactly.
So no, it's good. I mean, I've always been fascinated by stories, and so I talk about kind of the early book about, you know, about kind of reading Enid Blyton under the duvet as a kid. I've always been fascinated by story, and so I looked into a bit of the neurology of what happens when we hear stories, and kind of various powerful kind of chemicals are released in our brain. So, you know, when you read the stories in your book, cortisol's get produced in people's brains, which makes them want to pay attention. You know, when there's another chemical is oxytocin, which is the same chemical that bonds a baby and their mother. That's why we really care about what happens to characters in stories. You know, another one is dopamine. It makes you feel when you turn the last page of a book, when the credits roll at the end of a film, it makes you feel good. And then what's fascinating is as they've kind of scans the brains of people as stories are told and stories are listened to, what they found is that exactly the same chemical pattern is released in the person telling the story as the person hearing the story. So what, you know, it's kind of like you sync your brain to the other person's. That's why storytelling's so powerful. That's why music videos, don't just have a picture of the bands telling their story, they, playing the song. They tell a story. And it's why social media, it doesn't just say take a photo on Instagram. It says tell your Insta story, and it's why Jesus was kind of cheating when he said, I'm now going to tell you the truths of the universe. I'm going to tell you a story. He kind of created them and their power and the person who he was telling them to. So really, but yeah, that's a bit of the storytelling stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I thought maybe at this stage it'd be good, just to kind of model it for people. How do you tell your story? So just imagine I'm a guy you just met at the bus stop. Hey, how's it going? Yeah. What's your story? What would you say to someone in that moment?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian family. My parents both really committed followers of Jesus. I recognized that I probably made a decision to follow Jesus when I was 6 years old. Someone told me that God loved me, that he died for me and rose again, and that I could be his friend and go to heaven when I die. I thought this was the best news ever. I was even more excitable then than I am now. And that was my moment of choosing to follow Jesus. But I think through my teenage years, I probably had to recommit that decision as kind of various kind of challenges and I think I'm making that faith my own. But the rubber really hit the road for me when I was 21. I was sat having lunch with my mum. Phone rings and it's a family friend, and she says, "I'm really sorry, Phil, but this morning your dad has died." And these words completely ripped my world apart. And I had this choice in that moment to say either God stuff you for letting that happen, or God, I really need you right now. And I've been a Christian over 30 years. The closest I've ever known God with me was in those first few weeks after Dad died. Wow. And people watching this might be going through all kinds of suffering. If you are, I don't know all the time why it happens, but I do know that God is with us in the moments of suffering. Yeah. One of the most amazing things about following Jesus is he gives us a real purpose and meaning. So I've found that in helping others understand the Christian story as someone who shares good news. But more recently, the rubber's really hit the road for me again, where I've been diagnosed with the same heart condition that killed my dad at 48. And there have been moments genuinely in the middle of the night where I've kind of woken up and my heart's been pounding and I've been thinking, am I going to die? And I can't tell you what a difference it makes knowing God is with me in that moment, but also knowing that whatever happens, I know where I'm going. And I don't know what my future holds, but I know who holds my future. And my story's ongoing as we've gone through coronavirus, and in the last year, I've lost 2 close family members to cancer. God's with us in those moments, and I don't know how people do that without Jesus with them. So there's a bit of my story.
Oh, that's very good. Thank you. Well, thanks for sharing. And it's quite vulnerable, I think, sometimes to share your heart, your heart struggles and your faith. It takes a bit of vulnerability. And I think when you do that, people actually respect it. It kind of invites a little bit from people, because when when you take that risk, I think sometimes people think, I couldn't possibly do that. I don't know what they'd think. But my experience is people think, wow, thank you for kind of giving me the privilege of listening. And then it kind of almost gives permission for them to open up a little bit as well. So thanks for doing that so much. I think in terms of, and I picked up a little of this before, that authenticity in friendship and sharing your story, but also listening. I thought what we shared a little bit before about that listening is so important. And it just, I don't know, the chapters you wrote on it just kind of caught me. Maybe because it's such an obvious sort of juxtaposition between the distracted friend and the passionately listening friend. So how would you, in terms of people watching this, like we're all now digital natives to a certain extent. We live in a distracted, digital world. What advice would you give to people to become compassionate, listening, loving, peacemaking friends in an age of distraction? What advice would you give?
Wow, that sounds like a 45-minute lecture, to be honest, Dan, but I'll do my
45
best.
seconds.
I'll do my best. I think the first thing to say really is that I think friendship has changed even in this last, year. So, we saw some friends in person in the garden for the first time over the last couple of days. So I think it's a really good time to be thinking about friendship and about our relationships in our lives. I think my advice would be, first of all, be really intentional and be really realistic. We just don't have enough bandwidth to be friends with all of our Facebook friends. And I think so. Find a few people and kind of throw yourself into a relationship with them. And I think as you identify when I told my story, being open, being vulnerable. So often it's vulnerability that unlocks something in other people. You know, I don't want my friends to just talk to me about the football and just the, you know, superficial events of their lives. I want people to I want to be vulnerable with other people. I want to, you know, that's how we connect, isn't it? And share your struggles and your pain, share your failures as well as your successes. You know, those kind of things make real friendship and make friendship work well. So I think that's the first thing for that first kind of really intimate group of friends. I think there's a wider friendship that we have where we can be really generous and encouraging with people as well. So I think there's a kind of, I had this thing where during lockdown, I had a week off in like November, and I was really, I was missing people. So I decided to kind of write like 20 postcards to, 20 fellas in my life and just say, just really value you. And I can't have the same level of contact with them as I have with 2 or 3 friends, but I can check in now and again and say, how you doing? Just miss you. And a postcard or a text or something. And, you talked about technology. Technology can be the enemy of friendship when we're distracted and trying to have a coffee with someone and our phones are going off and we're looking at that rather than the other person. But technology can be mastered to give us a far wider and deeper friendship with other people. Yeah. And then the final thing I'd say around friendship is when you're out and about, smile and reach out to people. Yesterday morning, I bumped into this guy called Kyle who'd just moved to our area. He'd been in, and he was a guy who I kind of in early on the conversation, I said, tell me your story. And he tells me how he's been homeless and been in prison and just moved here and he's got this flat with nothing in. And I've noticed that as I kind of walk around my community, as I run, as I smile at people, more people, I think because people are starved of connection, smile back in a way that they didn't used to. And being open to friendship, I think is really, really key at this time. So, yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thanks, Phil. I feel like we're coming into land. Maybe there's time for one more story. So there's one story in the book that I don't know why it just absolutely captured me. I took a photo of it and sent it to my mates on WhatsApp. That's digital technology for you. But it's a story of Lauren. Could you just tell us that story?
Yeah, of course I can. Yeah, Lauren's amazing. She we've known Lauren for a number of years. She was having a really tough time a few years ago. And my wife, Danny, this isn't a story about me, this is a story about my wife, Danny, as a friend. And she was just there for us. She looked out for us. She prayed for her. She cared for her. There was a time when Lauren came to live with us in our house, and her job was selling gas and electric to people. And Lauren was on a journey of faith. And so we thought it'd be really good to invite her to Alpha at our church. So Danny invites her along to Alpha. And it's the Tuesday morning before Alpha's at 7:30 in the evening, and she's having a rough day. She texts Danny with, I think, quite a colourful text, colourful language, not appropriate for Facebook Live before 9 o'clock, and says that she's not coming because God's not answering her prayers and she's really fed up. So Danny's like, oh, what do I do? So Danny's instinct, she's a lot holier than me as my wife, and she says, I'm going to pray. So in that moment, she prays for Lauren, and what happens next is Lauren puts her phone in her pocket, having just texted Danny this angry text. So Lauren then knocks on this door and starts to talk to this guy about changing his electricity tariff. And as she's doing so, she's somewhere on a journey of faith, probably wouldn't call herself a Christian at this point, but she starts to hear God speaking to her some words for this guy. So she says to this guy, do you believe in God, mate? And this guy's like, is this part of the pitch for the, for the electricity? Yeah. And then she says, these words kind of, floored him. She says, you've killed someone, haven't you? And this guy's like, yeah. I've just come out of prison. And Lauren's completely unfazed, and she's like, yeah, I knew that, God's telling me, and he's telling me that you not only need to forgive yourself, but you need to know that he forgives you for what you've done. So isn't that a really cool story? My guess is that he bought whatever she was selling at that point. But anyway, she comes out of the meeting, she calls Danny, she tells Danny the story. She says, I'm coming to Alpha. She's really annoyed that Danny's been praying. But so it's a story about the power of prayer, but it's also a story about how God is at work in people's lives. Anyway, Lauren came to Alpha. She's now doing great. We're still in touch. We're great friends. And it's a lovely little story about the power of prayer and, God being at work in someone's life.
It is, yeah. And it's also the thing I liked, and maybe this is what captured the heart of the people I met on my journey, is that God doesn't just take the people who are polished and experienced and that kind of stuff. He takes people where they're at, even when people are having a bad day. Sometimes he wants to intervene more when someone's had a bad day because he wants to show a bit of love. Yeah. That's the nature of a good father. And so for me, it caught the compassion of God, but also it showed the power of Danny, of a praying friend, and someone who cared. So Yeah, let's, in terms of like, so, you know, it feels like there's loads of exciting threads in your book and mine. How would you kind of, how do you draw this together? So people going, you know, people logging off now, going to put the kettle on or have a beer or whatever. Yeah. What's your sort of take home point that you want people to be left with?
Yeah, Dan, I thought I didn't come up with this. This is your copyright thing at the very beginning, but I loved the idea of story bearers and peacemakers. And so I think what we'd love to urge everybody to do, not because we care about book sales, you know, to some extent we do, but what we really care about is people being impacted by these books. And so I think our great encouragement to you, if you're watching this, is please buy both books. Please take a look. I think they sit really nicely alongside each other. You can choose which one you read first. We don't mind. Mine's a bit shorter. I'm not quite as clever as Dan. But let us know what you think. Tell us, in all seriousness, we would just love you to check them out. I think they're also really accessible for people who are on a journey of faith. You know, wherever they're at. I've had some lovely feedback around people who wouldn't yet call themselves Christians around the book, and I'm sure you're the same, Dan. You'll have people who are just on a journey of faith, and if you're interested in the power of a relationship, if you want to be a better friend, if you want to make a difference in your community, these are two books I'd urge you to read. And in terms of how you can stay in touch, both of us are kind of on social media. You can find us. You can grab the books from the IVP website or from the Hodder Faith website, and wherever you get your books. But Dan, it's been really lovely to chat to you. Just great to connect. Thanks for making the connection, and thanks for tonight. Really brilliant to hear some of the inside track on Finding the Peacemakers. So yeah, thank you.
And thanks to Hodder Faith for hosting it, and to Bern Leckie behind the scenes for making it happen. We'll love you and leave you there. Phil, I'll see you hopefully again in real life when we're on hour 2. And to everyone watching, have a wonderful summer, and hopefully it'll be a summer of freedom and peacemaking and story bearing.